The beginning of the end is here. Recently, Kevin Feige confirmed that Secret Wars will reboot the MCU. And with Fantastic Four First Steps hitting theaters this weekend, that insane mid-credit scene
It's supposed to be nuts. We should go see that.
and the most powerful being in the entire MCU in the grasp of our hands. Before getting to all of my thoughts, I'd love to hear your spoiler-filled thoughts on the future of the MCU in the comments down below, but let's get into talking all things spoilers for Fantastic Four. I'm not going to necessarily go point for point throughout the entire film because this does take place on its own Earth 828, and that's kind of my biggest flaw with the entire film. Not necessarily that it doesn't connect to the overall MCU, because I do think the MCU could flourish in telling Elseworld stories, but I did really want to mention this in my spoiler-free review, which is already out on the channel if you want to check that out. But to me, the biggest flaw of not making this in the main MCU universe was just the fact that it is pretty inconsequential what happens to this Earth, and with that and Galactus, a universe-destroying threat, Silver Surfer, one of the most insanely interesting cosmic entities in the entire MCU, there is a lot you can do with tearing down the world that the Fantastic Four are living in. And the main reason I wanted this to be on a different Earth is because I wanted it to feel consequential in terms of threat, in scale, in size. And I mentioned this a lot in my Thunderbolts video a couple of months ago, but with Doomsday being so rushed, us running into all of these problems with taking Kang out of the equation, they needed to build stakes really quickly, and it feels like this film, they completely missed out on that opportunity. And that's why I think just overall I'm much lower on the film than most people. My biggest theory going into this film was the fact that the Fantastic Four would lose, and I feel like that not happening makes a lot more of this movie just get diminished story-wise, thematically, and just overall being interesting for the future of the MCU. Before getting into the Doctor Doom of it all, I do want to say I think the movie did its job in making me really interested in this group of characters, and that's what I think 100% needed to happen going into Doomsday, especially since it seems like Mr. Fantastic is going to be the lead of the Avengers. I mean, you look at the pull that he has in this movie where he's able to get the entire Earth to listen to him. Stuff like that does make him a great candidate for the lead of post-reboot MCU, which we'll talk about Secret Wars later as well. This might get a little convoluted, so stay with me here, but we know that the Doom in Doomsday and Secret Wars couldn't be from the main 616 MCU universe because of Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man. So, okay, that's fine. It was going to be a different universe's Doom that was going to be a big bad, but I feel like him not being present in this film made the entire movie just feel a little less important in the grand scheme of Doomsday and Secret Wars. And I understand it's not supposed to be a direct trilogy. It's more so supposed to be like soft general ideas being brought over, but I feel like they don't even really do that. All we get is a tease of Latveria in one of the diplomatic meetings that Sue Storm is leading, and obviously Doctor Doom isn't present there. Now, this brings up the point that yes, Doctor Doom is in the background, he is plotting. We'll get to the mid-credit scene later. And I didn't necessarily expect / want Doom to be in this film, but we are one movie away from Doomsday, so shouldn't there be somewhat of an urgent threat? I think Doomsday will flourish if it's from Doctor Doom's perspective, and I have a lot more thoughts on that in a second here. But again, my biggest problem is just the fact that the Fantastic Four don't lose in a world that feels expendable to an extent. And I also didn't really connect with the world just because the second half of this film takes place pretty much solely in the Baxter Building and like the one block around them. And so after you have a lot of deep and understanding care for the world and the Fantastic Four's public relationship over the 4 years that they've originated in this world, I feel like that's the perfect time to kind of tear it all down, not in a cynical way, but just in a way that makes everything more interesting. It's not that the world is expendable, but it kind of is. Like, the threat of a new universe being destroyed is so interesting to me. And with the Thunderbolts post-credit scene, I also thought it makes sense, and I predicted that the only option the Fantastic Four would have against Galactus or Doom or Silver Surfer or any universe-ending threat is to run. And one of the most important and essential and powerful teams in the MCU running from a threat, I feel like that would speed run all of the stakes in Doomsday and Secret Wars, which kind of is what we need at this point. After Galactus probably destroys their universe, because who can really stop Galactus, they were going to come to the MCU main universe, they were going to warn everyone, and then they were going to fight against probably Galactus or Doom or something like that in Avengers Doomsday.
What?
Even if you liked the ending of Fantastic Four, you can't tell me with a straight face that the strongest heroes of Earth being scared and having to run from this threat wouldn't have just made you even more excited for the future. Anyways, we can talk more about Doom and the future of the MCU in just a second. I did want to mention a couple of other small elements of the film I did like that I couldn't get into the spoiler-free review. The first thing is Shia LaBeouf. Silver Surfer is done phenomenally in this film. Like I mentioned earlier, I just feel like Silver Surfer is such an interesting character. The loneliness complex that this character has is something that isn't really matched in the MCU. That 10 to 15 minute Interstellar-esque cosmic chase sequence is absolutely phenomenal. And to go one step further, not only is the intergalactic chase stuff really cool, but the fact that Shia LaBeouf tries to grab the baby out of Sue and then Sue goes, "Johnny, kill her." Like, it's the coolest thing I've ever seen. Silver Surfer is literally surfing on lava and water and black hole particles. Like, it's genuinely the coolest adaptation. This is the definition of, I know the word peak is overused all the time, but this is really how you execute a character like this in every single facet perfectly. On top of the cosmic chase stuff, I think the space exploration aspect of this film is also so intriguing. I wish we got a little bit more of it. A lot of it is really only used in the whole Earth teleportation plot device, which I think is a little bit of a stretch. You're trying to transport the Earth and an egg, but obviously it doesn't end up working out. They kind of put all of the power into one of the towers and create a black hole, which I thought was a really interesting way to defeat Galactus, but I also don't think you should be able to defeat Galactus. I think the way that they end up defeating Galactus with Sue's power of motherhood, it's kind of all a little cheesy and corny to me, but so is like the whole first half and like 60s retrofuturistic vibe of this film. So second time around, I was definitely more open to liking the ending of the film, but the first time I was a little bit cynical towards it. And the final thing in regards to like the plot and writing of this film, I do think that the Thing's character is done so poorly. Ben Grimm is one of the most interesting characters in the entire Fantastic Four lore, in my opinion, and the fact that they didn't do an origin story, and I've talked about this a million times at seeing the film for the first time, and I just stand by it even more on a second watch. The fact that these characters are supposed to be cosmically altered human beings, you don't really feel any of that. There is no character depth or interesting character writing, and that's proven with the Thing's character. The fact that his whole clobbering time thing is a joke throughout the entirety of the film, and then at the end of the movie when it actually happens and he says it and hits Galactus in the face, I just didn't really give a shit because his character isn't interesting to me. They make Johnny a little more interesting and give him slightly more depth than they do in the older films, but I don't mind Johnny just being a hotshot because his character in general is more shallow, and that's kind of the point of him, whereas the Thing is actually the opposite of that. In the mid-credit scene, we see Dr. Doom sitting with Franklin, touching his face, and there's a couple of things to talk about here. Firstly, this is such a poorly executed setup, in my opinion. Like, no one wants to hear me bitch about this, but the composition and the way that he's just like holding the mask out, we don't really get to see a face. I understand Robert Downey Jr. probably wants to get paid $1 million per second that he's on screen. I understand why they didn't do that. But again, I just think it was pretty cheap. But I mean, it does its job, you know? I feel like through that one moment, we really do understand a little bit of the dynamic between Franklin and Doom, which I'll get into that in just a second here. But this does prove and expand upon one of my biggest flaws of the entire film, in that Franklin is so insanely important, and he's genuinely one of the most powerful characters in the entire MCU, that I just felt like his inclusion in this movie felt so rushed, but I understand it's so necessary. And I understand that he will probably be the main plot point or plot idea that gets Doom across all of these universes and starts conquering things in Doomsday and bringing together worlds and incursions in Secret Wars. And so there's a lot that Franklin has to do, and I understand why they shoehorned him into this movie. But the post-credit scene and the way how poorly the post-credit scene is not only like directed, but just like looks in general, I think it is a good encapsulation of the entire film's problems, in my opinion. Using the context of Doom not being present in the entire film, but Latveria being teased in a lot of the diplomatic ideas of the film, I think he is here to just straight up take Franklin, and I think that'll happen. I don't think it'll be much of a fight. Obviously, Sue Storm was able to push Galactus somehow, some way. By the way, the power scaling with Sue Storm is absolutely insane, but staying with Franklin and Doom, Franklin's ability alone to create and destroy universes, I think it goes even past Doomsday. I think it goes into Secret Wars with incursions and Battleworld. It's so hinged on this character that it had to be forced into this film, in my opinion. This dives a little deeper into the comics, but I did want to quickly mention this, that in the comics, there are actually two fantastic kids, Valeria and Franklin, and the first one is actually Doom's goddaughter, and they're really, really close in the comics to the point where I think they'll just mesh the two kids in this film. I think the small touching the face emotion going on here could kind of lead us to a more personal relationship, turning into using Franklin for multiverse conquering, more of like a parent and kid abusive relationship in terms of just using them to conquer the entire universe. None of this feels that interesting or present because of how shoehorned in and not present Franklin and Doom are in this film. All this to say, I think they'll just combine the kids and maybe make an emotional connection between the two. But yeah, I think we're only getting one kid, and I do think it's just the main plot device for Doom to move forward. I have a lot more thoughts on Doomsday, and I'll get there in a second, but I want to talk about how much more linear I think this story is going to be than at least I anticipated before. Looking at it from the Thunderbolts perspective in that post-credit scene, I think Doom takes Franklin, and then the team is just searching for Franklin for the majority, maybe the beginning of Doomsday. I don't really know when they're going to do this, and this is kind of my problem with the film, is the fact that we are going directly into Doomsday. I mean, we have Spider-Man, but I don't think Spider-Man is going to connect with Doomsday. I think that's going to be its own singular story, and I don't think they're going to try to hinge it on the multiversal stuff as much, and Kevin Feige has mentioned that before. So all of this has to happen in the beginning of Doomsday, a movie that I want to be from Doom's perspective, but I'll mention that later. Fantastic Four are searching for Franklin, and they end up on our Earth where the Thunderbolts saw their ship. This is all in a linear story with what we saw in Thunderbolts, going into Fantastic Four, now going into Doomsday. And before we have anything to really do with a Doom storyline, his backstory, his anticipation, or what he really wants and what he's trying to conquer and do, the storyline is basically just a hunt to save Franklin. And I think it's going to be the Fantastic Four trying to not really convince, but just explain to people that, yeah, Franklin is an all-powerful being. He's our son. You have to trust us. We all need to get together and kill Dr. Doom and get our kid back. Maybe this is crazy, but I really want them to make Doomsday Doom's movie. Not like Thanos, where he was one of the most interesting and compelling characters of Infinity War, but truly, I want Doom to be the protagonist and like the top billed character on the sheet, I mean. And I think with Robert Downey Jr. in the role and the fact that they're going to have to pay him $7 trillion, I have a lot more faith in that. But when you look at the linear storytelling that the MCU has decided to do, the MCU feels like they are moving in a very strict storyline, like 1, 2, 3 happening, not 1, 3, 2, or trying to have a post-credit scene that teases something before the next movie actually comes out. It just feels like they're trying to do everything in a one-beat story sense, which is kind of annoying in my opinion. And I think what made it so interesting in the post-credit scene of Thunderbolts is how did the Fantastic Four get there? And then we just know nothing about that until the beginning of Doomsday, which is like the beginning of the most important ending of the MCU. In terms of Franklin and Doom, as I mentioned before, I think he'll be used as a pawn. Franklin's power bending and creating universes can really lead us into Doom's quest for an all-perfect universe, which ends up being Battleworld. I feel like this would be a really cool way to actually make the villain win. And when I say Battleworld, I mean creating a new future for the MCU. I mean, really ending the MCU as we know it, but creating the selecting every few characters we want to keep moving forward. This is an interesting way to make the villain actually win in terms of, yes, the future of the MCU is set, but unlike Thanos, by the end of Endgame, he really does lose. But here, Doom can still win. Like, Doom's threat can still be looming, and with the whole future of the MCU, you know, maybe Spider-Man will have PTSD to Doom or whatever the fuck they want to do, but I just think it makes it Doom a more compelling villain, because as of now, we really have no backstory, no understanding of Doom, and I think if you don't make Doomsday from Doom's perspective, there's just no way anyone gives a shit about this character by the time Secret Wars comes around. What's so interesting about Doom's character in the comics is his rivalry with Reed. And that rivalry is what leads him to trying to take Franklin and trying to really hurt Reed from the inside out. The only thing that can hurt this man is taking his own kid. But I feel no impact thus far. I feel no threat of him taking Franklin. I really don't give a shit about Franklin. Again, one of my main flaws with the Fantastic Four film in and of itself, but even looking forward, I just think the fact that he was so shoehorned in here makes me care a little less. There's one possible way that they can make me care a little bit more about Franklin or a little bit more about this team, but I think on the team aspect, they do a really great job in this film. they can make a Fantastic Four 2 before Secret Wars even comes out. Secret Wars doesn't come out for another 2 Decembers. Like, I'm pretty sure the next time we get an Avatar movie is when we're getting a new an Avengers Secret Wars movie. With that, I think if you kind of speed run through a Fantastic Four 2, we can get a lot more context, and it can be a middle of time story within those 4 years, making us care for Franklin a little bit more. Or it could be a Fantastic Four entering our main MCU universe set before Doomsday, or obviously you make Doomsday a movie with just Doctor Doom, but we do know that Avengers Doomsday will have Pedro Pascal leading the Avengers as Mr. Fantastic. But there is a pocket of time where you can tell another Fantastic Four story, in my opinion. And is that something they should speed out and do? I don't necessarily know. I just feel like it would work a lot better for character context. And maybe it could be a prequel of this. We've seen Doctor Doom. We've seen what he can conquer, and we've seen what he can do. I do anticipate that Doomsday will end in doom and despair. Like, I don't think that movie's going to have a happy ending. And then you give us a prequel of why Doctor Doom and Mr. Fantastic's lore and friendship and their rivalry is so interesting, and then you lead us to Secret Wars, which has at that point even more anticipation. That's really the only way you can justify doing a flashback movie in the midst of one of the craziest events in the MCU. We don't know the full extent to which Franklin's powers will work in the MCU, but after Multiverse of Madness, it does feel like the more Doom abuses the power of Franklin, like literally creating mass in the universe, more incursions will start to happen and deteriorate the universe as we know it. Obviously, that leads to things like Battleworld, but I also do wonder how it affects the ideas brought up in Multiverse of Madness with other Doctor Strange or mystical, magical creatures that actually have to do with multiversal problems. I really do wish we were getting a Doctor Strange 3 before Secret Wars occurs, and maybe that's what they could do instead of a Fantastic Four sequel, but I definitely think that Franklin has to die with the MCU. And again, we'll get into the reboot stuff in just a second here, but he's so powerful, and though I feel like the Fantastic Four, along with selective characters like maybe Thor or Spider-Man, etc., characters like that might stay, I think the problem creator has to die because it's such a big problem. Simply put, the power scaling doesn't work if Franklin stays alive after the MCU, but I think he's so strong that he can be the one to reset it. Kevin Feige recently came out and gave us so much new information on the entire MCU. I can't go over every single little detail in this video, so I'll link it in the description down below. But the Variety article is titled, "Marvel Plans to Recast the X-Men and Eventually Tony Stark After Avengers Secret Wars, but Reboot is a Scary Word," says Kevin Feige. There's a couple things to mention here. Kevin Feige did also reveal that he has 2 years left on his contract, which obviously does lead us to 2027. This makes a lot of people wonder, is he going to leave after this? I just don't really think that's the case. I think maybe in like 7 years, so I'm talking like after the next saga or the next phase or whatever the case may be. Throughout his entire tenure in the MCU, all Kevin Feige has wanted to do was make X-Men and make an X-Men universe, and that was a big part of the Fox merger, and so I don't think he would kind of fix the MCU and then just leave. He's really been fixing the MCU post all of this production reboot stuff that happened with Daredevil Born Again about halfway through that production, and then obviously Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four are the first films that are truly coming out after that fact, and they're getting great reception. So I think the MCU is on its way back up. I don't think Kevin Feige would leave right now, even though yes, it would be awesome to leave at the top. I think he cares so deeply about the X-Men characters that he wouldn't necessarily do that. The decision echoes changes in the composition of Marvel Comics following the 2015 Secret Wars storyline, which involved multiple timelines collapsing and reconverging, mixing up the characters of the main Marvel timeline in the process. Kevin Feige said, "We're utilizing that story not just to round out the stories we've been telling post-Endgame, just as importantly, and you can look at the Secret Wars comics for where that takes you, it very, very, very much sets up for the future," Feige said. Endgame literally was about endings. Secret Wars is about new beginnings. But Feige was also careful to not characterize the changes as a reboot. Instead, the executive said Secret Wars will serve as a reset for the MCU. Amy Pascal and David Hyman are now searching for a new James Bond, Feige said, referring to the producers of MGM's upcoming Bond film, David Cornswet, the new Superman. "He was awesome. That will always be the case." Feige acknowledged that stars who've retired their original MCU roles like Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans have made it difficult to imagine anyone else in their character's shoes, but it isn't an impossible task. A lot to talk about here. Firstly, with the reboot word and how scary that feels to Kevin Feige, there was a moment back during the Avengers Endgame press tour where the Russo brothers did say they wanted to direct a Secret Wars movie. Secret Wars inevitably resets and reboots the MCU timeline to an extent, where you can pick out new characters, bring them in. That's kind of how they introduced Miles into the main MCU timeline, or main Marvel timeline in the comics. A reboot was inevitable. They knew that this was a possibility, that Secret Wars was a timeline thing that could happen even during Endgame. Kevin Feige has also mentioned a couple times Kang, not Jonathan Majors by name, but the fact that obviously Doom was the plan all along. I think he's kind of bullshitting us with that, but nevertheless, I think they were going to have Doom come in and take the power from Kang and Kang Dynasty, because Secret Wars is a Doctor Doom and Reed Richards story. We knew that was eventually going to happen, but the fact that they took out that power scaling with Kang makes Doom a little bit less interesting, because obviously they haven't even built him up at this point. But if you look at a couple of the projects and then what Kevin Feige has said here with reboots and introducing X-Men after the fact, it actually does feel like originally they were going to fold together the new X-Men into the main MCU. We're talking pre-Secret Wars reboot, like this saga going on for a couple of more years, an extra phase or two mixed in there, and they can still do the picking and choosing characters out, keeping the new X-Men team. When you look at things like Miss Marvel and all of the mutant ideas within the Marvels and that X-Men, that Marvel's post-credit scene, I feel like doing a post-Secret Wars just makes more exciting world building and brings in new fans, kind of as a reset point for, if you watch stuff before this, that's great. You're going to love this universe, and I think we can keep that pace up. But for new people, it's a new jumping on point, and I think X-Men is an important enough family and idea and concept for people to be able to jump on. But yeah, with Miss Marvel and the mutant ideas introduced, it feels like something they wanted to do earlier. They just couldn't really do it. The whole idea of Secret Wars and Incursions, I think, works really well in terms of a reboot and a reset, like Kevin Feige has said, in terms of you're not going to be like, oh, we need to kill off every character, but we can kind of dilute down what characters we keep and what we don't keep, kind of streamlining the MCU. Now, this is also interesting because there were a couple of other things that were greenlit. Obviously, Jake Schreier is directing X-Men. Apparently, a Moon Knight season 2 was also just greenlit, which is really interesting and weird to me, because it's like Moon Knight is one of those characters. I'm not saying the show is horrible, but it's one of those characters where, yes, it was interesting, but that's not necessarily a project I needed to see in the MCU, especially if you're not building to something like Midnight Suns with Ghost Rider and Scarlet Witch and Punisher and all these different things. That's just not really interesting to me. And probably post all of these Secret Wars and all that kind of stuff, if you're going to give me a Moon Knight season 2, feels like that's kind of an irrelevant project for me to care about. But nevertheless, most of this stuff isn't confirmed nor denied until they announce it on a big stage at San Diego. So we'll see where that leads us. But guys, that wraps up all of my spoiler-filled thoughts on not only Fantastic Four First Steps, but the future of the MCU. As always, I would love to hear all of your thoughts on Fantastic Four, where the MCU goes from here, in the comments down below. Subscribe so you don't miss out on more reviews and rankings. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.